I could invite Ashley and Tabitha to take third place. We're now going to hear about another project that is currently ongoing, the Activating the Archive project, using museum collections to understand colonial legacies of African environment histories. This is a joint project, and Ashley is based at the Pitt Rivers Museum and Tabitha is based at the University of York. The project is funded by an HRC, NERC, and is part of the wider Hidden Histories of Environmental Science, Acknowledging Legacies of Race, Social Injustice and Inclusion to Inform the Future. And over to you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invite to the organisers for putting this together. It's been really exciting already this morning because it's just so interdisciplinary, and yeah, I think Tabitha and I both feel we're very at home in a very interdisciplinary space. And so yes, just waited. No, it's fine, don't worry. It's a lot to do a hybrid conference. I did one not too long ago, and then, well, we did all of our workshops hybrid, and yeah, it's not easy. Thank you. Yeah, just to say really, in the kind of interdisciplinary lens, what this project really afforded us, I think, which was so wonderful, was that it was a cross research council project. So this was a call that came out. In fact, some of you might have been funded or have known about it, involved in it. Various projects, but it was really for us, because we both sort of work in a very interdisciplinary way. It was fantastic because it meant that, you know, you had to have someone who was sort of AHRC remit and someone who was sort of NERC remit. And often I apply to both of these councils and I'm told I'm too sciencey, too environmental, or you're too humanities, you're too. So this was a really nice cross council funding, which I just hope there's more of. And so I was the sort of AHRC arm, and Tabitha, my colleague who would take the second half of the talk, was the sort of NERC arm, and it was a very specific call to look at sort of environmental science in sort of hidden archives. So the idea is that to utilize archives which might not be really immediately thought of as sort of pertaining to environmental histories. And so me being based at the Pitt Rivers, you know, I had already been looking at our collections very much for this kind of idea of environmental histories and what kind of colonial legacies are present in the collection. So it just afforded us the chance to really, you know, only a one-year project. So this is very preliminary sort of work, but we're hoping to expand it into a much bigger project. So what we're going to present today is just sort of how we got through in our year of doing this quite fun interdisciplinary sort of exploration, I guess, of the archives. So what we decided to do, because we only had 1 year and we felt like the task was very monumental to kind of, you know, look at archives for environmental histories and how were we going to do that, which countries were we going to choose, you know, how are we going to start doing this. So Tabitha and I essentially just put together a sort of network of people who we knew worked in a very interdisciplinary way, both from the kind of ecology environment side, but also from kind of, you know, archives, museums. We also had to sort of incorporate a policy or community angle. So we had some NGO colleagues coming in as well. And basically this was born out of the pandemic. So we had all of our workshops were hybrid, which obviously posed some challenge, but actually I think altogether worked quite well. It also really was absolutely crucial that the archives that we were working with, so the Pitt Rivers Museum photography and objects, were digitized, because that was the whole point, was that we were sort of able to sort of give all of our collaborators in this network access to collections. And then the idea was that they chose collections that they were interested in doing some research on. And then through the workshops, we all talked about collections together from our kind of different perspectives. So that was a key part of the process. And we're talking about very specifically about sort of British colonial legacies in specifically Kenya and Nigeria. We had to choose the Pitt Rivers Museum collection, as many of you I'm sure are familiar, but just the inside view of the collection of the museum, sorry. Is really from this map here, you can see mirrors the footprint of British colonialism in terms of where our collections come from. So not only did the experience of Tabitha and I kind of mirror some of the work in Kenya and Nigeria, we also had sort of interested people in the network from those two countries. So that's sort of where, you know, that's the only reason really why we chose those two countries to focus. But obviously, you can also see from the spread that there's quite a lot of the Pitt Rivers collections originate from these two countries. So the Pitt Rivers collection started in 1884 with a donation of General Pitt Rivers mostly archaeology collection, and then grew and grew and grew as anthropologists mainly working at the University of Oxford go out and do field work and are trained, and through this sort of colonial network, colonial service, objects, photographs, sound archives, manuscripts, all sorts of things start to flow back into Oxford and into this collection. So you can see here we have about we have over 500,000 objects, about 50,000 are on display, and really what we were trying to do with this project is to really make sure that the photography and the object side were integrated, because often research projects on the collection end up being just about the photographic archive or just about the objects, specifically looking at sort of the material culture, materiality of the objects, and not from kind of both angles. So we were very interested in making sure we combined photography and objects. I've already said that, so I'll keep going, but just to say that for this talk, we're just going to focus on a few of the examples of archives from Kenya. And in my last 4 minutes that I get, we thought we'd give a couple of examples of how we sort of use the Pitt Rivers archive to sort of tackle some of the main questions that we had on the project. And so this one was actually one of the ones I thought, you know, it was the kind of remit of the funding call, was about, you know, how can you sort of look for these quote unquote hidden histories of race, social justice, exclusion, sorry. And we were specifically using museum collections, this sort of colonial archive, to answer these questions, but this very specific point about informing the future. And I think that's where we also very much wanted to make sure that we were working with policy partners, we were working with people in this network who look at some of these issues in a sort of present and future focus, but in a way challenge them to look back at the past by looking at these historic archives. So many of our kind of network had not really worked with museum archives before, hadn't really looked at sort of historic photographs, had really thought about it in terms of it relating to the work that they do currently on, you know, mitigating things like crops, crop production in East Africa, or access to water, droughts, etc. A lot of what you were talking about this morning, actually. And so this was one of the ones that I thought would be the sort of most challenging aspect of our work, but then became, I suppose, our project became increasingly important in 2022, when, as part of this bigger project that the Pitt Rivers has been involved in for a number of years, working with Maasai communities in East Africa, not only looking at the objects and sort of archives that we hold in the Pitt Rivers that represent various Maasai groups in East Africa, but we've had this sort of long-standing project on getting better documentation of the objects. And of course, part of that is to actually get better understanding and interpretation of the objects in the collection with current issues. that these communities are facing. So one of our project partners, Yannick Nduinho, he came and worked with Tabitha and I throughout the workshops, and his object that he chose to bring to one of the workshops was this object here. And so this is literally what we would do before each workshop. All the workshop participants would look through the collections, database records that I would give them, and they would pick a couple that sort of resonated with either some challenge that they are facing in their own sort of lives, or if they're a researcher, something that related to their research around environmental history. And so Yannick chose this. I was particularly interested in this because I have a long-term interest in ivory. So we sort of got off on a tangent with me talking about, you know, the materiality of this object as an amulet, as something that's really important in terms of keeping sort of animals safe. Of course, Maasai being pastoralism being key to their way of life. And for Yannick, this was really interesting because they're still being made and they're still being utilized in the same way. So for him, the importance of this object really became, I guess, abundantly clear in 2022 when everything sort of kicked off in Tanzania, especially with access to land and land rights with Maasai communities. And so he was very much sort of pushing us in the network to think about how these archives in the museum can actually be used as really advocates for these sorts of sort of human rights, land rights, water rights issues. And he very much tried to get us to think about how tying the physical objects, the georeferencing of the objects in terms of where they came from, thinking about sort of how that might relate to issues today with communities in terms of their access to their own land, how colonial policy, especially in this particular case, due to sort of gazetting of land for national parks, meant that, you know, Maasai groups were forcibly removed. So even though this was really just the start of us thinking about this, we felt like, in a way, it was sort of, an interesting moment for Yannick to be sort of looking at the collections and using the collections to advocate for some of those issues. So I'm going to hand over to Tabitha to talk about the next bit.
Yeah, that was a fantastic explanation about what we were doing. I usually am just very happy to participate in research that makes me ask about environmental histories and looking at the past and how it affects the present and the future. And she brilliantly puts it in place in a much nicer way to speak to a wider audience. And so that's why it was really important that we try and think about how people can use museum collections. There's very much the idea that museum collections are only fixed to an anthropological view and a site of preservation, where you just collect things and keep them there for posterity, in a sense, sometimes for research, but a lot of posterity. So sometimes that's the thinking that's behind a lot of people's understanding of what museum collections are for. So what we wanted to do is really explore, can we look at these collections to understand what the past and what current environmental challenges are and what environmental histories are there? And so what we wanted to bring out and what came out through our work was the idea that museums are an archive and a data set in which we can use to explore environmental histories through analysis of objects, images, and conducting material analysis to try and better understand what materials, what resources were in the landscape and how those related to their use and the wider community and the environmental conditions they were in. But there is a large gap in how we understand environmental histories, particularly for the colonial period. We understand the colonial period as fairly clearly this demarcated point in time of oppression, but what was happening to people there in the process of this oppression? How are their environments being changed? How are they impacted by the colonial policies? How did this impact how they used landscapes? What was going on in the landscape? And so we needed to, what we thought we'd do is we'd look at these images and ethnographic data in order to try and understand material and resource use over time, try and think about how we can identify species that are in the landscape, species based on material objects, and we think about access to resources, because while we might think that that has ended, as Ashley has pointed out, colonial policies of exclusion and displacement of people still goes on in a different form. Nowadays, we have those challenges ongoing and can still see that historical record and can still see how it's affecting communities at present. And therefore, we also wanted to change the focus, and that will be one of the case studies I discussed with you about like expanding our ability to the lens at which we interpret the information from these archives. We're not just going to be using it for an ethnographic exploration or material analysis for a specific object, but we're going to try and think about it from different disciplines headings and pull it all together to try and build a more rounded understanding of communities and environments in which they lived in. And so the workshops tried to as Ashley has mentioned, when we're doing this, there's such a wide range of objects. Like sometimes we looked at the databases and we're like, okay, I'm stopping at page 30. I'm not going to reach 100. And this is true of a lot of museum collections and a lot of things that are not explored. And so this was an opportunity to introduce them to a much broader audience, environmentalists. We had chemists in our group, NGO groups, conservation policy makers, to a resource that they haven't had an opportunity to explore. And that way we can also pull in these different perspectives and understand and expand our understanding of the context of these materials. And so, for example, I'd like to give just a case study of some of the things that we're doing. Ashley had mentioned that we sit down in a group, we all pick objects from the collections. We try and make sure we curate a series of objects so that we make sure that people are not overwhelmed by the collections. As I said, they were massive. So one example is this shell beads as a biocultural heritage and also for landscape memories. So this is a series of 3 necklaces of perforated snail shells. That's what the record in the museum collection tells you. It gives you a little bit of information about where it was collected. But some of the interesting information we got from it is about the group of people that used this, which is the Mumbo cult around Lake Victoria. And one of the interesting aspects of that discussion was the realization that the cult was formed as an anti-colonialism, as a resistance group. So resisting the missionaries, resisting the colonial forces that were in that community at the time. And so they wore this as a symbol of their group cohesion and identification. So, but that's not the only thing that this can tell us. So these 3 necklaces can help us think about access and the value of the resources. Is this an easily accessible resource? So they had plenty of snails around. What does that talk to us about ecologies? Because what does that mean about the landscape, that there are a lot of snails in that area? Is that very viable landscape environment for them? But not only that, if they're easily available, does that mean they're not specifically valued in status, or so that everyone can have a necklace? Because it's just everybody collects snails every time. It's just an easy way to create ornamentation. Or are these snails very rare within the landscape? Is this something that you then need to show, I have this specific status? So what then you can do with that is then you're trying to now think about the ecological histories. Do you find that same species of snail within that landscape now? Also, has there been a break in the environmental record about the identification of the species within that landscape? And that's one aspect that you can think about. And then also you can think about that wider cultural and ethnographic context. So we've talked about this, the community responses to colonialism within that landscape, the use of these materials. What does that mean for how they interacted with other people? Since this is a means of identifying themselves, or is it, as mentioned in the other slide, funerary rites? Is this something that only comes out during funeral rites so that they can, as a sign of their group cohesion, but also as a sign of mourning? So those are the things you think about. So when it comes to thinking about the ecological aspect, about the identification of species, it also allows you to think about how long the environmental conditions, how changeable the environmental conditions are within that landscape, because then you can now start pulling that information in and saying, we're not finding evidence of these species now. Does that mean that they were lost? Were they actually from that area, or is this materials that they brought in through cultural exchanges? Are there other records that we can use that we can then try and flesh out an understanding of this? So you can just, as you can see from just that one image, from one object, you can pull out all these different aspects about understanding the ecological histories and the cultural interactions within the landscape, and not just about a description of the organization and the group, the anthropological group that was involved. Another case study that I'd like to give is about people on a footpath between fields of sorghum. So this was images by Evans Pritchard. Keep forgetting the name of the gentleman in the photograph.
The Colonel.
Yes. We never remember. I don't know why we never remember his name. We're always writing it down, but we forget. I'm sorry. So what happens here is, looking at this image was a really important and interesting way of thinking about incidental information in the background. So one of the people we were working with in the workshops, Chris Morton, is actually the one who brought this image to us. And then he pointed out to us that actually what happened is that everybody was interested. The group that he presented this research to, everyone was interested in the sorghum in the background. No one was interested in the people, the dynamics of that. And that's something that he actually speaks a lot about, because the placement of people in images plays a role in their perceptions. But everyone was like, wow, look at how tall that sorghum is. Why is it that tall? So it was a change in perception. And because the focus of this image was actually about her hat. It's a symbol for married women. So they were trying to capture that ethnographic information, that important information about, cultural place. And then it completely got diverted, discussing about environmental issues. And also we brought in other cultural contexts. So other speakers pointed out that she stepped off of the path. The previous images showed us that there had been other gentlemen coming across. And then we ended up having a discussion about the fact that culturally women give way to men. So this is a pathway. She saw a gentleman coming up ahead. A colonial officer is also approaching. She didn't know he was coming. He was coming to talk to her. So she stepped off the path, thought they were going to pass. And then this kind of dynamic, if we hadn't had people who'd come from that community, from that region, who've worked with people in that region, you wouldn't have been able to kind of pull that interpretation together, as you can see. So it refines our understanding of this cultural dynamics, and then obviously completely distracted everyone with thinking about the environmental conditions, about how did the sorghum grow that tall? Is it the soil condition? Is it the climate? Is it a change in agricultural technologies? Because actually tall sorghum like that is really difficult to harvest. So if you're mechanizing, if you're industrializing, you want it shorter so that the machinery works much easier. So it ended up making us think about that change. Is that change environmentally driven? Is it a combination of environmental and economic issues that have led to that change? And so that's one of the aspects that you find coming through these combination of disciplines coming in to look at the museum collections. But of course, it was all fantastic, but we faced a couple of challenges. We can't deny that we don't usually know where these images are collected exactly. So we said Lake Victoria. If anyone has ever looked at a map of Lake Victoria, let's just say you could get lost very easily, just along the shoreline. It sits between three countries, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and it's a large lake. It has very strong currents. It has diverse topographies and vegetation. So they just say Lake Victoria. We know this is on the Kenya side, but that's still a long coastline. So there's no geographical information. Also with objects, that's really a big problem. So georeferencing materials geolocating them within the landscape is a really important thing that unfortunately we don't have this information on. And so when also we're trying to think about the visualization and doing visual analysis of vegetation, was it green? Had it just rained? Was it arid? Having the images in black and white, which was actually a particular affectation of one of the photographers in the collection. There was color, but he was like, no, black and white works perfectly. So it's very difficult to then use that to try and be like, okay, so what was the vegetation like when he took these images, if you're trying to pull in that incidental information. And then there's a common habit of using the image as a record and not recording any information about the image, when it was collected, what it's talking about, who did the collection, what was in the area. So someone takes an image of this room and saves it on their phone. Do you remember 5 years from now, what was going on in this room? Who was talking? What was the meeting about? That kind of information is very common to happen. So it makes it difficult to georeference or identify landscapes. And then also there's that challenge of trying to use different methods and at different scales. So you're trying to look at a really localized selection of images and objects, trying to place them within a landscape and within a time period. You're working across very different spatial and temporal scales, and that makes it very limiting in how you can ground your understanding, as well as also being able to conduct material analysis on the objects, because a lot of the methods are destructive. Museums, again, would like to keep the objects and would not like it if you set them on fire to figure out if it's wood or something else. So that was one of the challenge. And also the processes that were involved in collecting these objects are also quite a challenge, because they were part of the same colonial processes that changes landscapes, that alter these people's cultures. And so, but that's not all bad news. Sorry, I'm running a little late. We did have so many interesting aspects that came out of this. It's finding out this wealth of resource, of data that we can then explore to try and look at images and biological materials that can help us refine our understanding of a period of time in which you might have diverse records, but not distinctly clear about what was going on in the environment and with these communities within those landscapes. And it also, like with the Living Cultures Project, we're bringing in communities with a cultural heritage and knowledge, and we can bridge that disparity. A lot of these communities haven't seen some of these objects that are held in the museums since they were removed. So being able to bridge that knowledge gap and reintroduce objects and materials that are part of their culture is also a really important aspect that came out of it. And also it's about building that knowledge and capturing and incorporating so many different aspects of expertise that can help restore with this stored in these collections, because we're trying to make it standardized how we interpret the information for each object that we analyzed. And therefore, we're able to try and make sure that we build an understanding of what gaps in knowledge we have. And particularly with the images, is expanding people's understanding of how they can be used for an informational context and refining that, but always with the caveat about why is someone taking the image the way they've taken them. An example of this is taking an image showing lush landscapes untouched by humans, is an entire city behind them. Ignoring that information for the sake of a specific narrative is very common in imagery, but you'd still be able to get interesting information from that aspect, with as long as you understand the caveat of what has been left out. So some of our future steps, we've had discussions and reflections, and we've managed to build a virtual exhibition for this that is slowly being in development. And we're trying to keep continuing this cross-disciplinary collaborations, and then also trying to build it into future research ideas. Thank you.
And finally, we've got Ceri Ashley, who's going to be presenting on documenting environmental knowledge through, with, and in material practices. Ceri joined the British Museum in 2018 as head of the Endangered Material Knowledge Programme, EMKP for short, and helped launch the programme. EMKP gives grants to support the documentation of material knowledge systems that are under threat and in danger of disappearing. It also provides free access by stewarding that knowledge in an open access digital repository. And ENKP has just celebrated its 5th anniversary very successfully. And so over you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation and opportunity to join this really beautiful and lovely session. I also just want to say a very, 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 very big thank you to Anna, who's making this possible, because I'm supposed to be here talking about the opportunities of new archiving, but we are utterly beset with problems with my laptop, my BM account, and everything like this. So it's a reminder that the optimism must be tempered with reality. But we can see something here. So I'm really very happy, and we're working on it. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is this program, Endangered Material Knowledge Program, another horrible acronym that Acadia seems to favour. So apologies for that. But I want to sort of use this experience and this program at the British Museum as a way to sort of think about what we can do, the potentialities of collecting anew. So one of the key things that I think for me is that I'm not actually dealing with existing collections. I'm working with a global community of scholars who are creating new records. So we are, it is born digital in this context. So what are the opportunities or the affordances that maybe these new media can give us as we look at particular sets of experiences that are related to the material world and the making material world. So I want to sort of explore that a little bit, but obviously in keeping with the theme of today's topic, it's how that also sort of bleeds and dissolves into conversations about environmental knowledge as well. So that sort of, how can we start to sort of break down maybe or reimagine some of these sort of ideas around nature, culture, space, and the types of knowledge we're collecting. Can I carry on? Brilliant, thank you. Yeah. So just to give you a sense of who we are, what we do. This is to say, it's a global program. We've been going 5 years. We're based at the British Museum, and we offer grants annually to anyone really, based on a competitive process, to carry out original documentation work on material practices, contemporary material practices that are in danger of disappearing. The knowledge is being lost. And I'll come back to in a moment on what we mean by material practices, material knowledge. And you'll see here that there's this global remit or this distribution of these kind of grants. And this I don't think actually even has this year's grants. And so in total there's around 82 grants that are currently in operation in 51 countries. But what's been really noticeable throughout the programme is the very high number of applications and grants awarded for projects within Africa. And I think this year, as of last week, when we announced the most recent awards, it's 31 projects in all these different countries, which I'm not going to add up here for time purposes, but it gives you, I think, hopefully a sense of the scale of activity and the interest in this kind of way of documentation, but also that sort of urgency and interest in material knowledge, the made world. So I talk about material knowledge. What is it that I'm actually talking about? Well, in effect, this is a sort of an interesting departure for somewhere like the British Museum, which is so object-centered, so material-focused. It's there, those sort of great big doors that you walk through that experience. It's about objects, it's about objects in cases, about objects in relation to each other. This isn't about objects. This is about everything that happens around those objects or those spaces or that architecture. It's about how these objects come into being and continue to be in the world. And it's about the knowledge systems, myriad knowledge systems and skills and experience and knowledge and dexterity that enable these unique iterations and sort of alchemy of the material world. And this is an example here from one of the first projects we funded, which is on gold in Ghana, the sort of gold waste. I think you're probably all very familiar with this, but just unpacking the kind of technical process, the skills process of this lost wax process. So it's not necessarily about this object, which we already have in the collection. It's about the records and the people and how the workshops, the spaces the pyrotechnology of the people who are making this and creating this, and how they're being used and why they're being made. And what also became apparent, not just the kind of interest within researchers and communities within Africa, was the fact that this was something that became very quickly moved away from what we might think of as traditional object and material stories. And rapidly it became obvious that there was a desire to sort of move this into sort of an environmental made world, so to speak. And there's a nice example of this. It's another project, is a project in Kenya, led by Patrick Muundu from National Museums of Kenya, on the baobab tree on the coast in Mijikenda. And it's about the kind of the whole ecology, the environmental ecology, but there's the cultural ecology, the food, the space, the use of the baobab tree as a space to sit, creating space, a human space, but also a space, for example, to catch small rodents. And you see here on the image on the right, this is the baobab fruit that's being cut and used to make traps for different types of rodents. You find sort of a little bit of detail, the different types of rodents that are being fought. So this sort of linking of sort of material world with these sort of huge environment. There's no surprise. Ultimately, I mean, this is, material world is about how different resources are pulled together and brought into association with cultural knowledge. So what I want to do in the rest of the presentation is to use 2 or 3 examples from projects to go in a little bit deeper and to sort of give you some sort of sense of what the collections are beginning to look like and the kind of work that people are doing and the possibilities and the potentialities. So at this point, I'm absolutely going to admit that this is not my research. I'm here to tell you about other people's fantastic research. So I'm here as a sort of EMKP representative, and I'm lucky enough to work with these projects. And so I would encourage you to also go and have a look at the website and see all the other projects that people are doing, and also the repository to follow up and see more about the ones I'm going to cover today. So the first I want to talk about is a project that's recently been completed, again in Kenya, and this is on beekeeping in the Cherangani Hills. And I think this is this is one of the first projects we funded, and it was a clear indication of that sort of that point of contact around food and cuisine and practice, and in this case it was around that process of making beehives and apiculture. Which is, of course, beekeeping knowledge, and how all these different knowledge systems come together and work and collide. So we in MKP support open access digital repository, which we host, and all the grantees that is where their material gets uploaded, gets published, and is made publicly available. And there's a big emphasis on that, on visual. On sort of not necessarily sort of documentary, but also a very sort of visual, that sense of understanding process and action and movement. So, for example, it's maybe hard to see here, but just to give you a quick taster of some of the images that have come out of this, of that process of making the beehive, which eventually, just here, is being put up into the tree, but here you see it's being smeared with dung, it's being transported, it's being hollowed. It's being stripped of bark, all these different processes involved. And this is a project that sort of teased out all the different processes, all the different raw materials that are being used. And the project, if you look at the repository, you'll see that how there's also the journeys that are being made to go and find the particular materials. It's the learning process, the apprenticeships, and that sense of where the project lead and team, which is Sanalon Rockcliffe from Cambridge, now from Cambridge. They're using visual just to capture this sense of landscape as well, I think, as you can see in some of these images. But it's not just static. One of the key things that we try to support within the EMKP platform is this audio visual. Now, this is obviously, all well and good, and this is very nice. You see here's a film of the lot being cut or the bark being stripped. What is so important about this medium is this is the embodied knowledge. As you look and watch, this is the knowledge and understanding of trees, of their materiality, of their behaviour, and how to interact with them. It's not actually something that is verbal or written down, but it's through experience, it's through muscle memory, it's through embodiment, through tactile response. And I'm going to try and go forward a little bit in this one, and it shows you at some point, you see the transition from one experienced. It's not gonna let me do this. Okay, you're gonna have to take my word for it, or go and look at it on the repository. But you get the one very, very experienced axeman, and you can watch him, and it's just beguiling. You're just watching, and it's coming off. It's like butter. It's beautiful. It's smooth. It's fluid. And then he brings in someone else to try, and suddenly the axe is bouncing, and the sound is different. And it's you suddenly realise what you've been looking at. And it's not something that you can capture, you can try and capture it, with thick description, but it's something, it's got an impact, it's got a power. It sort of really shows you that experience and that idea of how we're expanding, how we can document and think about environmental knowledge of the material worlds, of the environmental worlds. So, this is another project where, as I say, it's about the ecological knowledge, but also embedding it in the landscape. And I'm just going to quickly mention, though we won't be able to, some of this material is still being uploaded, but participatory mapping about how to go from that image at the top to something like here, where you've got the parkway, which you're annotating, you're showing it through, and your ability to sort of move back and forth, to toggle back and forth between these different resources, to try and sort of look and understand and get that sort of impression or a taster of that sort of sensory experience of being in that landscape, doing this process, working with the bees. So the second project is, I'm going to reference, takes us to West Africa, to Burkina Faso. And this is a project led by Laurence Dooney from Humboldt University. And it's on wild silk. And you can see these two images here. This is this is the cocoon, and it's been, this the caterpillar is now emerging this beautiful butterfly, and then collection of the cocoon, which is where the cocoon is made from the silk, and the silk is harvested and is used for the creation of fabrics and textiles. And in another video, we can see here the process. This is the cocoon. Yeah, putting together, going from that knowledge of the material, but also you're getting that sense of context, the environment, what else is going on, the sound, the non-diversity, the teachings, the wind, the sense of emotion, experience. And this is sort of a approach we see quite a lot of in the kinds of projects that people do. And so we can follow the story of between. Am I in 2 minutes already? No. I'm sorry, just the notepaper's been moved on. From the cocoons, the raw material, through the sort of processing to this beautiful finished product. And there's a woman wearing the sort of the fabric that she's made. But what I wanted to bring this project out in particular is because Laurence and the team are really, I think, pushing us to think about who's active in this. We've seen those women, they're making, they're producing, but also she's very actively engaged with this idea of the sort of multi-species approach, and looking at the silkworms themselves as actors in this. So see here, just as we saw the women carding and spinning and making the silk, what we're seeing here in their documentation, and I hope you can see, is actually the silkworms processing and making the cocoons. And so they've been playing with this idea of, that actually the makers are the insects and the animals, and what's the relationship? Who is making what? How is this interacting? And this recently been explored through an exhibition at Humboldt University on the Douala with this idea of sheen, and you can see it still on. If anyone's going to Berlin, go and have a look at it. I thoroughly recommend. And so, for me at least, I think it's an interesting way to, as someone who's sitting in a museum, surrounded by 8 million objects, is we tend to see the records of these sorts of objects, and we're always trying to enliven them. We're always trying to sort of bring them to life and show some identity. And that's what, you know, it's great to be able to link this object, which was collected by Laurence, to the film of how it was made. But also, equally, should I be trying to work to help these actors, these people who are also in our collection now, these people, these, you know, these non-human, these players within this, the cocoons, the caterpillars, the moths, how can they be brought to bear into these conversations? I think I still have some time, so I'm going to move to my final example, which is work in Ethiopia. And I'm just using this one particularly because there's a strong focus here on trying to do 3D modeling. So coming back to that idea about, you know, what are our opportunities? What can we potentially do in this new way? And also sort of the increasing accessibility and of different sort of documentation techniques like 3D. And I think, you know, I mean, I love looking at this. It's great. It's fascinating. But, you know, there is a question here is like, well, so what? What's it actually really doing for this? Why is this necessary? We can all, you know, sort of look at 3D and it looks beautiful, but we need to sort of take it through to the next level. And so one thing I would sort of like to suggest that we're at the beginning of our story with this. This is something we're starting to see people doing a little bit more of. But it is a way that we can start to sort of think about how we bring together the different worlds, how we could have melt those boundaries a little bit and allow people to sort of get that experience of a sort of a combined integrated world a little bit. And you see here on the right, this is an image of me trying out the VR headset for this. You know it's me because I'm wearing the same skirt. And over there, this was on our 5th anniversary. To be honest with you, I nearly fell over because I thought I was going to fall off the edge of this Ethiopian plateau. So I'm not going to fall over today. I didn't fall over them, but it was a first steps for us in trying to think that. And I wanted to bring this up particularly because during the workshop, during the conference, we also had a workshop the next day with another project in Brazil that's been using a lot of VR headsets and the immersive experience. And there was a really interesting story told that came from that, where they'd been they'd recorded the building of a ceremonial house. And they took the VR experience back to the community. And this member of the community, very important member of the community, she put it on and she sort of walked through this experience, and she was like, yeah, God, yeah, look, there's that, and this is that, and this, and this, blah, 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 blah. And the project and the anthropologists were like, what? So what? Who's that? And she saw a spirit deity in the VR experience. And she was like, well, didn't you put her in? And this, when we started, it's sort of, I wanted to think about that, or that experience, was that sort of idea of what actually is their environment. This is the, you know, that is part of that landscape. That's how she's experienced that landscape in this remote place. And so, I mean, just sort of pushing again about idea of what indeed is in the environment or is in the landscape. This is the created landscape, the imagined landscape, the believed, the lived landscape in. So there's spaces for something really quite unexpected in this. Now, I'm going to finish by a little technical note, because I have a project digital curator who wants me to tell you all about this. We are hosting these sort of our 3D models on Sketchfab, the British Museum Sketchfab, and it's great. You can go and have a look at it. It's very nice. You get that experience. However, we are looking in the future we are developing with our repository provider, which is Figshare, a space where not only do you have the sort of final model, but you have all the data associated with publicly available. So you've got the metadata, but also the paradata, something I'd never come across. But what I understand, or what she's explained it to me, is the settings decisions around the making of the object. So we're talking about how we can experience this, we can modify this, is all there. We can put this, and we can put that out there into another new sort of space or environmental landscape that we can engage in different ways. So I'm going to end there, but I am going to say, please get in touch if you want any information, because we are opening the next round of grants in October. And that includes a legacy digitization grant, which is a new grant that we have introduced, which is about, instead of a sort of born digital documentation grant, this is one to digitize existing records that relate to past material practices, which may either the material practice is now disappearing or endangered, or the archive itself may be endangered, and that might be of interest to somebody. But yeah, please do get in touch and yeah, have a look at the repository and the website. Thank you very much.